Welcome everyone to this Chatham House webinar. I'm Rashmin Sagu, Director of the International Law Programme here at Chatham House. Chatham House has been convening on the big issues of international relations for over 100 years. And today we will be convening and discussing the issue of Israel-Palestine, understanding ceasefires and humanitarian pauses. This event is a joint initiative of the Chatham House International Law Programme and also of the Middle East and North Africa Programme. Today, we are live on the record. This session is being recorded and live streamed. There will also be in the chat function some details of how you can tweet on social media using the hashtags CH Events and @Chatham House. We're delighted that all of you can join us today. And we have some wonderful speakers who have been willing to share their expertise on these really live matters. In a moment, I will also explain how participants can contribute to the discussion in the Q&A session towards the end of this webinar in the chat function. But firstly, if I may introduce our esteemed speakers. Firstly, we have Emanuela Chiara Gillard, who is an Associate Fellow at the International Law Programme here at Chatham House. She is also a Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and a Research Fellow for the Individualization of War project at the European University Institute. Secondly, we have Major General retired Blaise Cathcart, KC, who's a former Judge Advocate General from between 2010 and 2017 from the Canadian Armed Forces. And Major General Blaise Cathcart served as he joined the Canadian Armed Forces as a legal officer with the Office of the Judge Advocate General in around 1990. We also hope to have today another esteemed guest speaker, Ben Majeko-Dunmi, who is the Chief of Staff for the UN Relief and Works Agencies, UNRWA. He's worked in several departments of the UN across a period of 30 years across 5 world regions, including for UNICEF, UNHCR, UNDP, and OCHA. He hopes to join us at some point during today's discussions, but has been regrettably taken away for an important high-level UN meeting, internal UN meeting, which is often the way of our Chatham House events, where we have such esteemed, distinguished speakers who are trying to split themselves between different meetings. But just delighted that we've been able to have our experts with us here today. We will be proceeding with a moderated session, firstly, with our experts to discuss these key topics. And then there'll be an opportunity for question and answers from the audience. And we'd encourage you to please put your questions in the chat function, and we will be able to answer them in the last 20 to 30 minutes of today's session. I should say, depending on whether Ben is able to join us, we may have to be a little bit flexible on timings today. So please bear with us. But the idea of having both Manu, Blaise, and Ben with us is really to ensure that we have the legal, operational, military, and humanitarian perspectives on these important discussions. As I say, this session is on the record and being live streamed. And without any further ado, I think we'll go straight to Manu, who is recently actually just shared her insights on this issue in an explainer for Chatham House, which will also be in the chat function shortly in case colleagues are interested in more detail. But Manu, please, there's so much confusion and about the various terms that are being used at the moment. Even today, this evening, in fact, there's been some breaking news that Israel will begin to implement a series of 4-hour pauses in North Gaza starting today. It's unclear as yet whether it's going to be over consecutive days or otherwise. But it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts, please, on what do these terms mean? What is a a humanitarian pause? What is a general ceasefire? What's a truce? Please shed some light.
Thank you so much, Rashmin. And yes, we have seen a number of calls in the past few weeks, and a variety of different terms used for them. The objective of these calls is the same: limiting the impact of the hostilities on civilians. But there are important differences in precisely what's being called for, and in particular, the purpose and consequently the extent of the suspension of hostilities is at the root of some of the disagreements that have arisen. And the use of inconsistent and ambiguous terminology really has contributed to the confusion. A variety of terms have been used, as you say: humanitarian ceasefire, humanitarian pause, humanitarian truce, or ceasefire more generally. Now, none of these terms are defined in international law, nor, importantly, are parties to armed conflict required as a matter of law to adopt any such measures. The implementation of these kinds of suspensions of hostilities may, however, facilitate giving effect to obligations under international humanitarian law. For example, a suspension of hostilities can facilitate the evacuation of the wounded and sick, something that's foreseen by international humanitarian law. Or they might allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief operations, something else that's foreseen by international humanitarian law. All the arrangements that have been called for foresee a suspension of active fighting. However, the key differences relate to the purpose of the suspension. Is it in order to allow a specific humanitarian activity to be conducted without risk of harm from the active fighting? I would say this is what underlies the calls that are prefaced as humanitarian ceasefire, truce, humanitarian pause. But there's also call for a more generalized suspensions of hostilities. And there are significant differences in practice. Suspensions of hostilities for specific humanitarian purposes tend to be limited in scope, in terms of duration, but also in terms of the location. Although they pause the fighting, they tend to be brief and localized. The same isn't the case for the generalized ceasefires that are not related to the conduct of specific humanitarian activities. These broader ceasefires can affect the pursuit and attainment of the strategic objectives of the hostilities. And it is this type of ceasefire that some states have been unwilling to call for.
That's so helpful, Manu. And just to reiterate that point, so you've mentioned no definition, no legal definition of these terms. The key difference relates to the purpose of the suspension. Are they for humanitarian purposes, or are they for wider reasons? And so, would you say that this is so? Words matter here, and the purpose behind the words matter.
I would say it's the purpose, an understanding of whether a pause is going to be in order to allow particular humanitarian activities to be conducted, or whether it is broader in nature. That's, I think, the heart of both the confusion, but also the divergences of views.
Thank you so much for busting those myths and trying to get some clarity on those basic points, because we're hearing so many terms being used by different organizations, different politicians. So thank you for setting the scene for us there. Blaise, if I may turn to you, from the military perspective, to begin with, actually, Blaise, Emanuela mentioned mentioned international humanitarian law. This is also, of course, known as the law of armed conflict. And I wondered, did you want to just start just very simply by saying what that is, what balance is involved in this term? Because sometimes there can be confusion there also.
Yes, thank Rashmeen for the introduction, and greetings to my other fellow panelists, and greetings generally to people listening in from Canada, where I'm located right now. This is obviously a very important and timely topic. I'll be speaking largely from my perspective, 27 years as a military legal officer with the Canadian Armed Forces, on many missions, both international and domestic. And I always focus on what I call an operational law perspective. So it's taking into account very much what the commanders and soldiers, sailors, air persons are doing and thinking, but also doing my best as a legal advisor to translate all the laws that may be applicable. And in this case, of course, you've highlighted already the law of armed conflict, which is a term I prefer over the well-known international humanitarian law, because I find the latter term causes a lot more confusion, frankly, particularly with military troops who are actually involved in the bringing of violence to various people and property. It's hard to think humanitarian in those circumstances. But essentially, from this perspective, when we have a conflict, and obviously this one between the IDF as the fighters and the Hamas forces, it can be very complex from both a factual and legal perspective. What we can say generally is when there is an armed conflict of this nature and intensity, that the law of armed conflict applies. And that, generally speaking, is consisting of two bodies of law. One we call conventional or treaty law. And in this case, things like the Hague Conventions over the years, and more particularly and more recently, the various Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional two protocols of 1977, and of course the third protocol on the distinctive emblem. These form essentially, although there are other treaties out there dealing with weapons, for example, chemical weapons or incendiary weapons, et cetera, that apply as well. But when we talk about the heart of the law of armed conflict from a conventional law perspective, it's really these conventions, Geneva Conventions, Hague regulations, and the additional protocols. There is also the other body, which both from a legal and non-legal perspective is a bit more ambiguous and difficult to fully grasp, and that's called customary international law. And that's where certain states or organizations who may not be able to be formally part of treaties or outright reject the treaties and don't sign or ratify them could still be bound by the very same essence of the law through the application of customary international law. And customary national law is difficult because obviously there's varying points of view and different interpretations, but it primarily focuses on states who generally accept a practice that they and other states are doing over a period of time. It can be months, but more likely years, maybe even decades, combined with what we call opinio juris, that they consider it to be binding law, even though there's nothing written or they haven't signed up to it formally.
Thanks, Blaise. And I think that's helpful as an overview. And I just wonder if you could maybe give us your impressions on and your insights on how what these terms mean from a military perspective in a very practical, operational way, just so that we understand that. And Manu may also have some thoughts on how do humanitarian pauses, truces, ceasefires work?
Yes.
In fact, if you don't mind, Blaise, maybe I'll bring Manu back in just to set the general perspective on how they work in practice, and then bring you back on the military side, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. And yes, I think it's important for us to understand that suspension of hostilities for humanitarian purposes must be agreed to by the warring parties. We need agreement between them in terms of the precise times, locations, routes, and who is entitled to benefit from them. And precisely what is required depends on the very specific purpose of the pause. For example, if the purpose of the pause is to allow humanitarian relief to transit, there needs to be agreement as to the routes that will be taken, the times when it's safe to do so, which organizations are entitled to participate, what arrangements, if any, must be put in place to ensure that only relief items are transported, and also which populations may benefit from the relief. To give you another example, as far as medical evacuations are concerned, while the wounded and sick civilians and fighters must be able to benefit from them, the arrangements are going to have to specify, for example, that weapons will not be transported. And I think it's important, again, to understand that the pauses don't affect protections and obligations under international law. They're just a way of giving effect to them to ensure that relief operations can transit in a manner that's safe, and they reduce the risk that they may be caught up in hostilities, or that people trying to reach the humanitarian assistance may be caught up.
That's really helpful, Manu. Sorry, you were about to carry on?
No. Over to Blaise.
And really to say that, just to thank you for emphasizing on the need for that agreement between the parties, and the specificity of the agreement is so important. I imagine for the reasons that Blaise mentioned, that the people on the ground need to know, whether it's the military people, humanitarian, operational colleagues, they need to know exactly what has been agreed so that the terms can be operationalized. But Blaise, would you please be able to give us some insights as to how does that work from a military and operational perspective?
Well, yes, and Mano did a great job of covering the ground there. I would just add quickly, before I get into focusing on the concept of ceasefire, which is probably the most common term that we hear today, that in that same context, yes, the experience has shown that the far majority of pauses, to use the broad term, but ceasefires, or maybe what sounds like an archaic term, but still very much alive in practice and legal language, is the term armistice, is out there as well. There's also the aspect that the UN Security Council, acting under its authoritative powers, could either call for a ceasefire, which many states don't view as binding in terms of they must do the ceasefire called upon, but the UN Security Council could also go further and actually order the ceasefire, in which case states would have to comply with that direction under their obligations under the UN Charter. I just wanted to throw that out. But for sure, as Manu has noted, the far majority and most likely scenarios in which pauses of any kind, and ceasefires in particular, arise will be when the warring parties, belligerent parties involved, consent, agree, negotiate either directly or most often through a third party, neutral third party, whether that's another state or another international organization. That's how the negotiations will start, and they'll work out the details and go from there. I can generally say, somewhat oddly, that in the historical development of terms, armistice developed first as sort of the term that would be the major pause or suspension of hostilities. Ceasefires would historically lead to an armistice. I would say, since the end of World War II, the terminology has changed, where most commentators, practitioners, states tend to say ceasefire is sort of taking the place of the term of armistice now. And generally speaking, there are two types. There's what we call a local ceasefire or armistice, and a general ceasefire or armistice. The local one is usually, it can even be done by local commanders without getting the senior leaders or decision makers of the states or organizations involved. And they could be done most likely for assisting injured and dead on the battlefield, for example, most in an emergency type scenario. The larger, more effective general ceasefire, that's over history and in practice, where it brings a complete halt to any hostilities across the whole spectrum of the geographical location of the armed conflict that's underway. And that's very important because in the local ones, you could still have fighting in other parts of the geographical region, except for that one local area where the ceasefire is implemented. So a general ceasefire, and I think that's why you see states, in this case, Israel, may be hesitant, because it comes with a much larger package of do's and don'ts, if I could put it that way. Number one, in terms of don'ts, under a general ceasefire, it essentially means there is you can no longer legally do offensive operations or take territory from your enemy or adversary. You can still, in terms of do's, you can still prepare in the event that the ceasefire doesn't work and fighting is resumed. So you can do a lot of what might be termed passive activity. You can reconstitute your troops. You can reconstitute your ammunition. You can rebuild some of the structures that might have been damaged from there. Importantly, you can continue to seek information and intelligence about the enemy. And as long as that doesn't violate it, the ceasefire in terms of looking clearly like an offensive action, you can still engage in that activity. So that's from a military perspective. What I can say more particularly is that from the soldier, sailor, air person, special forces member on the ground, who are quite savvy these days, and I would include all fighting warring parties in that comment. They will have heard all of these terms as well, and probably be as confused or more confused than we are. What I've learned through my experience is, for the troops, it's our job to try and translate all of that ambiguous, perhaps conflicting language down to what we call operational language through military orders. So the troops will basically say, we don't really care about what terminology you're using. Just tell us what we need to do in compliance with our orders and with the law, of course, and we'll get on with doing our tasks at that point. So I think that's a very important takeaway, that it's not left to all the thousands of troops and fighters on the ground to start saying, well, we think humanitarian pause means this, or we think truce means that, or we think cessation of hostilities means this. That's not their responsibility, nor should it be. It's for, number one, the diplomatic political masters to give orders to the military chain of command, who then give orders down. Now, I'm talking from my clear experience dealing with professional military forces. When you're dealing with organized armed groups, in this case, like Hamas, I believe there is a kind of chain of command that goes on, but I don't know in terms of its effectiveness of translating the orders down. But that's how it should be working, even for an organized armed group as well.
Thank you so much, Blaise, for really getting us into the reality of what happens operationally from a military perspective and what would be needed. That's really valuable for this discussion. Manu, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to start looking at some of the questions that are coming in already. I hope you don't mind, Blaise, either. There's a great one from Jerome Puri that I'd like to come to. But before I do so, were there any comments that you wish to make on each other's interventions so far, just to give you that chance?
I think the point that I was going to make next actually tied in with where Blaise stopped, which is for these arrangements to provide safety, which is their objective, they must be respected by all parties. So very clear instructions must be handed down once a particular arrangement, pause, cessation of hostility has been reached, must be handed down to all the parties that are active in the area, those conducting military operations, maybe from the air, but also those present on the ground. The essence of suspension of hostilities in order to facilitate particular humanitarian activities is that the activities in question are exclusively humanitarian and also demilitarized. So if party to the conflicts abuse the arrangements, for example, by diverting relief supplies that are transiting and are intended for civilians, or moving any movement or using the movements of the relief convoys, for example, to provide cover for their own military operations, this risks leading to a termination of the pause in that particular instance, and may put the safety of humanitarian actors and also of the civilians at risk. So it's fundamental that instructions be handed down to everyone as to the nature of the agreement, the purpose, the modalities, and also that they be complied with by all sides.
And tell me, just before, just linking onto that, because it's related to this point of clarity that everybody needs to know what's needed and what's been agreed to, and the level of specificity is so important in those agreements. But where we're hearing this, again, the idea of the breaking news that's coming in this evening about implementing possibly a series of 4-hour pauses in North Gaza from today. We don't know yet whether those are over consecutive days or on specific dates. Could you maybe explain a little bit about how that might work?
I'd say that what struck me the most about this announcement isn't so much the duration and whether it's consecutive days or not. This can be communicated. What's more striking for our conversation is that it's unilateral. The IDF made the announcement, but it's not something that Hamas has agreed to. So my question, I always say for these arrangements to be safe, to provide the safety that they're intended to provide, they've got to be agreed. So my question here is, if it's a unilateral announcement and arrangement, what happens if one of the other parties carries out hostilities from the areas that are meant to be subject to the pauses? It hasn't agreed it won't. What happens? Will the IDF respond? Will it not? This to me really highlights the value of agreed upon arrangements. That's the risk that underlies this one.
Thank you, Manu. I'd like to open up the session to our audience who've kindly joined us today. There's a huge number of questions that are coming in already. Ben hasn't yet been able to join us, and I suspect he has been tied up by with his other meeting. But there are some great so I'm afraid it means that we won't have we really wanted to have the humanitarian voice here today, as advertised, in order to be able to explain what the humanitarian the realities are on the ground for humanitarians working in Gaza at the moment. However, it's possible that he may join us shortly. But in the meantime, if anyone has got questions, please continue to put them in the Q&A function. I'd like to firstly take Jerome Puris. He's got a series of questions there. Blaise, Manu, I'm not sure if you can see them, but I will read it out for the audience. What mechanisms can or should be in place if any of the 4-hour pauses are violated? Are there international mechanisms to monitor or enforce the pause in both duration and geographic scope? There's a couple more questions, but maybe I'll leave it there for now. Manu, would you like to start?
Yes, and that's an excellent question, and it kind of goes to my point, which is it was a unilateral arrangement. So we don't see any of the modalities for ensuring compliance with the arrangements. Normally when arrangements, suspensions of hostilities for particular humanitarian purposes are negotiated, there is an arrangement for the parties to engage via a neutral intermediary normally. This is not something that we see with regard to unilateral arrangements. So again, while a positive development, it is more risky, not as safe as something that is agreed upon, precisely because there's no, I think the term that you use, monitoring or enforcement, is too strong, but at least a channel of communication to ensure its proper functioning.
Thanks, Manu. Blaise, did you want to come in on that one? I have another question for you, but please go ahead.
Yeah, just to agree and echo Manu's comments that I think obviously everybody in the crisis itself on the ground and around the world welcome anything that looks positive, as this seems to be. But I can sadly have to reassure people from a practical, legal, and operational perspective, because it's only a one-sided decision. It's really it's up to the IDF and how it wants to handle it. Obviously, it's up to Hamas as well. If Hamas agrees that it will somehow honor these 4-hour periods, all the better, and especially if they would do it in a formal agreement with the IDF or through a third party. But if they continue fighting, almost 100% sure the IDF is going to continue fighting. That's just the reality of the battle space. If the IDF wants to assume more risk to not fight back during those circumstances in order to allow the pause to take effect, and we're not 100% sure because there's no details about what the real purpose of the pause is. We hope it's focused on humanitarian relief, but we don't know. We simply don't know. And because of these these aspects, that it's not nearly as formal as a ceasefire arrangement or a more specific written agreement, and even with those ceasefire agreements, there are really no international groups or bodies that formally regulate those things. There'll be plenty of people looking for sure and being critical or not if things are violated, but it really is dependent upon the two warring factions to truly, honestly, in good faith allow the pause or ceasefires to have the effect that they're designed to. But something that's being proposed today, a one-sided unilateral pause, it's hopeful, but I think the reality is it can fall apart in minutes.
And that goes to the heart of the trust that's needed when you're trying to when creating these agreements and having very clear terms as to what both sides have together co-created and agreed to, possibly with that third-party intermediary that Manu mentioned. The next part of Jerome's question was actually, how can we ensure that humanitarian access is provided outside of a pause or a ceasefire? Shouldn't we be calling for a permanent and safe access modalities based on the responsibilities of the parties to the conflict to ensure civilians have access to humanitarian assistance? It's a great question. Manu.
Absolutely, no, and that should be the starting premise, that there is that there is constant and safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian actors. However, the reality is that it is a zone of very active hostilities, and therefore, in every situation where there are active hostilities, humanitarian actors will engage with all parties that are involved in order to ensure that they can transit at a time that's safe, that doesn't impede military operations, that doesn't put them at risk, that doesn't put the civilians who are trying to reach the humanitarian assistance at risk, and may also have to agree to particular modalities that the parties require. So, for example, frequently searches to ensure that humanitarian convoys only transport exclusively humanitarian goods. But yes, absolutely, Jérôme, that is ordinarily how things would function. That is what we ideally want to happen. But the reality is that in situations of active hostilities, you will always have an engagement with all the parties present to ensure that you can operate safely. In this particular context, it's been framed in terms of suspension of hostilities.
Thanks, Manu. Blaise, you're welcome to comment on that one, but I'm conscious there's so many questions that are coming in. And if I may turn to Kate Connolly's question, which is, what kind of input or influence does the military have in negotiations around a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause? Do they provide data as part of the negotiations, or is it completely separate?
No, that's a very relevant question and a good one. Again, it's made a little more complex because we can never just speak of all militaries or all armed groups being the same, because we have obviously professional state armed groups in Western democracies. We have armed militaries in authoritarian states. We have what we call non-state actors or organized armed groups that are no state affiliation, and some of them have very advanced systems of discipline or command and control. I could say in the general terms that from a professional military such as the Canadian Armed Forces and as I believe the Israeli Defense Force is, absolutely they will have input into the decision-making process. But again, it goes back to how is your structure set up within your particular state. In democracies, decisions are ultimately made by prime ministers, presidents, et cetera, on advice from in this case, the head of the IDF, or in the case of Canadian Armed Forces, the Chief of Defence Staff, and they'll definitely have heavy input into that, and they'll have probably the only real source of granular level of facts on the ground. So as Manu's highlighted several times, any kind of suspension of hostilities or pause, it will have to have details about what does that mean, going both ways. From literally from the soldiers on the ground who are seeing and hearing things, translating that information up to their military bosses and eventually up to the political masters, and then back down again to tell the troops in detail what is it they can and cannot do and how they can facilitate the purpose of the pause. So the short answer is certainly in professional militaries, there will absolutely be input into those decisions. For states with authoritarian regimes or non-state actors, I can't be as confident that that would happen, but there's a certain common sense that would dictate that they would have to get information from the equivalent of their troops on the ground as well.
Thanks so much, Blaise. There's a huge number of questions that have come in. A lot of them are actually on legal issues concerning the conduct of hostilities or other international law matters, which are outside the scope of the subject today. So I have seen them, but it's not something that we're going to have time to cover, but certainly very topical. What I thought I might, but there's also a bunch of questions that's asking about, for example, the role of multilateral organizations, what role they might be playing, what their positions are, what their influence at all might be. We could perhaps extend that to other actors, including like regional actors. And there's also a couple of questions concerning, Manu, you did mention this earlier, but perhaps we could go over the ground about who are the guarantors of a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. Who is it that can ensure that these terms that are painfully agreed are then enforced? There's a few more coming in, but perhaps I'll leave it there for now. Manu, would you like to start?
Yes, I think we've got to be quite careful in understanding what, for example, the UN can do. As you know, there have been resolutions of the General Assembly calling for humanitarian pauses. The Security Council hasn't managed to reach agreement on it. But as I say, these are just calls. They're not binding. It's really left to the parties, usually through a neutral intermediary, to reach agreement. So that is very much the role of the General Assembly and of other regional bodies, which is they can call for something, it's putting pressure on it, but ultimately it's a question of what the parties agree to. And I think that what is extremely important is whether there is an intermediary helping them reach agreement on the specific, helping them reach agreement on the establishment of a pause of some sort, and also on the precise elements of it. Who can this intermediary be? At times it is the UN. So, for example, when there are so-called days of tranquility for often vaccination campaigns, it's UNICEF and the World Health Organizations, the actors that would actually be conducting the campaigns, that negotiate them. At times it's the humanitarian actors themselves. ICRC constantly negotiates between parties to allow to operate in safety. The Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations could negotiate the modalities of some kind of pause, again, for the system more generally. It can also be a state. So this is what we need. A resolution of the General Assembly doesn't change the things in practice. With regard to guarantors, I think we've got to lower our expectations. It's not as if it's an enforcement mechanism of any sort, but again, to the extent that there are clear details spelt out and there is an intermediary, it can be a troubleshooting channel of communication.
A good way to put it, Manu. Thank you.
Could I just add to that?
Yeah, please, Blaise, please. Thank you.
Just to re-echo a point that I made earlier on, and it goes to, again, the whole concept of multilateral organizations being involved, or guarantors, as the term was. There is a scenario, I think in this case, unlikely given the makeup of the Security Council and their affiliations with the people and fighters involved, that theoretically the Security Council could order a ceasefire. So from a outside organization ability, that would be something that from a legal and I would hope political and diplomatic perspective would have to be taken in all due seriousness. The challenge there would be if it's not complied with. And an example that the world knows pretty well, I think, is from the second Iraq War, where the Security Council Resolution 687 essentially ordered a ceasefire on the state of Iraq. And it had a number of conditions that could be met at the time or continuing as long as the resolution. I'm not trying to open up the old can of worms of the next invasion of Iraq, but that was the reality of the Security Council getting involved to be able to do that. Odds are not very favorable in this case, given the affiliations, the political and otherwise, of the Security Council members and the warring factions here, but that is out there. But again, same thing. It's ultimately whether the Security Council orders it or the warring factions come to an agreement. It's ultimately left to the warring factions to really determine, just as it was with the warring factions to start the armed conflict. It's up to the warring factions to pause it or end it at the end of the day.
Thank you, Blaise. Another question that's come in from Eileen O'Keefe, which has just jumped off my screen. Give me 1 second. Can we have examples of agreed pauses between state and non-state actors? That's one question. I don't know if you have any off the top of your head. Otherwise, I can take a couple. Blaise is nodding. Otherwise, I could have taken.
Well, I have one that I know of, and I don't pretend to know all the the granular details, but there are in fact more than one over the years in Colombia between the governments and the FARC, the organized armed group that eventually they came to a peace treaty at the end of the day, which is an example of the warring parties going through it. But there were, over the long history of that non-international armed conflict, several instances of agreeing to pauses, largely for humanitarian reasons. And sadly, there are as many agreements as there were. I think they're all violations of those agreements over time by one or the other party, because that just seems to be the nature of the business, that it's these agreements are very tenuous and at best, and ultimately really do rely on the good faith and trust and compliance of the parties that agreed to them in the first place. But anything, as we've talked about, and we know ourselves just from daily life, and any factor can jump in out of the blue and tip the balance of one side's perspective on the ceasefire arrangement, and then the ceasefire is off either formally or de facto because fighting starts up again.
Thank you, Blaise. That's such a helpful example to understand and contextualize the discussion. Manu, did you have any comments? Otherwise, I had a follow-up for Blaise. I wondered, Blaise, just because you mentioned some points earlier as well, just about how to translate the political messages that are received to the people on the ground that are implementing this. And that's on your side, you're talking on militarily. Ben hasn't been able to rejoin us, sadly. So I think we have to assume he's stuck at this important UN meeting, internal UN coordination meeting. However, I wondered, would you be able to give a sense, given that we're in a situation of war, extremely messy, to say the least, horrific scenes, whenever we watch the news. Operationally, people are tired, the humanitarians are tired, military folk are tired. So there's again that need for clarity of the messages that you mentioned. How does it work on the ground in terms of coordination of the different activities? So would it be on the military side, the hierarchy giving the clear messages, and then on the humanitarian side, whether it's the UNRWA or the UN, other parts of the UN, ICRC, other humanitarian actors doing likewise? I'm just wondering, can we have a flavor of how is all this coordinated and synchronized between the different actors involved?
Yes, I'll start by saying not easily. Number one. So from a military perspective, and particularly the military commander on the ground perspective, history and lessons learned, hopefully they're learned. Sometimes I just refer to them as observed rather than learned, regrettably. But the lessons that the military can learn from previous missions, and not even warfighting missions, it could be peace enforcement, peacekeeping missions as well, that you're going to have a clear influx of other organizations, mostly non-governmental organizations, mostly humanitarian focused organizations, and they'll have competing interests because they want to do their job properly, and that's usually in a way that consistently displays neutrality in the conflict. But the reality is, at some point, they'll have to deal with one or both of the warring parties, or multiple warring parties, depending on the nature of the conflict. And again, I go back to my experience with professionally trained military forces. They've developed doctrine and orders and policies to create military-civil liaison cells, and that's so you'll have often soldiers, but also government officials from the state, from Foreign Affairs Office or Department of Justice, whatever, working with the military, working with these, often plethora of other organizations to try to coordinate, what is it everybody wants to do in the theater of operations. And if there's a ceasefire or suspension agreement in place, how do those organizations, first of all, get a hold of those agreements, which they should? That's the best way to inform them of what they're about, is to tell them and show them what it is, and then start to work on how we can work together cooperatively so they can deliver their humanitarian consignments, but also being still respectful of their neutrality, which can be very difficult when you're in areas where there still may be sporadic fighting, to look like, if you're one of these organizations, that you're traveling in a IDF convoy, you'll be considered to be on the Israeli side right away, and vice versa if you're dealing with Hamas. So from a commander's perspective, that's the biggest practical piece to do, is make sure you have a well thought out structure in place to do all this consultation and liaising, often on short notice, because these things can pop up like we've seen today. But that is still very dependent on getting as clear a direction you can from the political masters above the military commanders. If that message is not clear and blurred, it's going to be very difficult for the military to translate that into a clear order for the troops on the ground as well.
And that was such a Blaise. That was such a great overview of the situation, how you coordinate these activities, and really practical insights on how these agreements are operationalized. I see Ben has been able to join us from UNRWA. Ben, thank you. I know you've had a really a day of many moving parts, so really grateful for you joining us. I might just, if I may, ask you the same question I mentioned to Blaise just now, which is how are the if there is whether it's a humanitarian pause or a ceasefire that's been agreed by the parties, how does it work operationally? How, from a humanitarian perspective, how is the coordination put into effect so that the people on the ground really understand the message and what is in the terms of the agreement? And then how do you coordinate with the different actors? So, Blaise was just talking about what happens on the military side and getting the messages to the military people on the ground.
Thanks so much, Rashmin. Sorry for coming 50 minutes late to a 1 hour panel, of which I was a member. It's extremely difficult to make this work. The situation in Gaza, we know it from afar, but from inside, to give some numbers before I get to specifics, we estimate about 730,000 people living in 151 UNRWA buildings, with typically 4 lavatories for 12,000 people, often with no water, And now that for several weeks, those numbers are only increasing as people move down from the north. The dynamics of trying to deliver assistance within southern Gaza, we have no access to northern Gaza, or almost no access, are extremely complex. We have to juggle trying to get trucks in, trying to offload trucks, trying to work out where we can get fuel from, how much fuel do we have left, do we have any drivers who can work. All of our staff are almost all of our staff are themselves displaced. 99 staff at least have died, and everybody has lost family. So the dynamics are extremely difficult. We don't even know from one day to the next what will be on a truck and where we'll be able to move it to. So if we do have a humanitarian pause, or what we would like to see, a humanitarian ceasefire, it's very, very difficult to make good use of that, quite apart from that there's the complexity of that. Are both parties, or all parties, respecting it? How long is it for? Is it well communicated? Even if it is well communicated, do people trust the communication? Because there have been an enormous number of communications over the last 4 weeks, including many flyers informing people you should leave your home now, and they leave the home, but the home isn't bombed, so they go back to the home, and the neighbor's home is bombed, or the flyer doesn't mention their neighborhood, and the wind carries it, and they get the flyer and they think, well, was it my neighborhood? Was it another neighborhood? And so forth and so forth and so forth. So yeah, the communication of the ceasefire has to be clear. People have to believe in it. People have to trust that it will be respected. And on the humanitarian side, we have to be able to function in an operational way. Even in over the last few weeks, we have managed to bring in a number of trucks, but the arrangements are set up so that the trucks will arrive by 11 a.m. in Gaza, and then we have a whole distribution plan to distribute to various bakeries and to various shelters to try and reach the 731,000 people. But the trucks don't come in until 7 o'clock at night because of various reasons on the Egyptian side of the border. So suddenly our operation plan from 11 in the morning during daylight hours has to be implemented during nighttime hours, and there's no electricity. There are very few lights. The roads are blocked. It might be that the route that we had agreed with the Israeli security forces is impassable by debris on the ground, and the trucks need to take a different route, which alarms the security forces, and they're worried that the aid is being used for other purposes. So just to say that a humanitarian ceasefire sounds good, but to actually make it good, you need a wide range of different things to happen, almost none of which are actually present at the moment.
Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us and for those insights. I'm conscious of time. There are so many more questions I could have asked you and brought from our audience as well who've joined us. But I think what I'll do instead in the last few minutes is perhaps to ask each of you, Manu, Blaise, Ben, in that order, if there's just a couple of take-home points you wish to leave the audience with, and then that will give Ben a chance to also see the comments that Manu and Blaise have been talking about in the earlier session. But if there are any final reflections or points that you'd like to make based on today's discussion, Manu. Oh, Manu, you're on mute.
My first point is, as you already noted, Rashmin, there were lots of very important questions in the chat on the conduct of hostilities more broadly, and we're not discussing that here, but those are very legitimate questions to raise. With regard very specifically to what we are discussing, I think, again, if we are talking pauses for humanitarian purposes, the importance of something that's agreed, that all the parties agree to, that is, as Ben said, accurately communicated, so it does actually provide the safety that it is intended to provide, and then obviously the need for it to be respected. That's on the very focused discussion of humanitarian suspensions of hostilities for humanitarian purposes. Clearly, what we need to look at is a wide range of modalities for bringing humanitarian assistance into Gaza. There were a number of comments about the possibility of a channel to bring medical supplies from Cyprus. Again, I don't think there's a lack of medical supplies outside. What needs to happen are arrangements that provide parties the necessary reassurance. And I think one of the key concerns is about diversion of humanitarian assistance coming in. And I think in this context, as in all other contexts, these are concerns that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Manu. Blaise.
Yes, thanks very much. I agree with Manu that there are, I'm sure, as I've seen in the chat boxes, a plethora of other questions relating to law of armed conflict and international law generally, which are very critical and important to look at. But we have narrowed our focus very specifically to this concept of pauses and ceasefires and armistice. And so I would just, reiterate from a military perspective, again, the key is going to be for both sides what their military or armed force leaders agree upon, either directly on the ground or through their political masters, and perhaps with a third-party neutral negotiator. Any arrangements, and that's, I see, the only realistic, practical way to have a real effective pause is to have a written agreement that the both sides, at a minimum, get to see and can comply and implement, but ideally to share it with the world so that we can also see that there's good faith and trust at least starting to be formed through the agreement. But from a military perspective, again, it's just simply making sure that whatever the arrangement said is delivered clearly through orders. And there's different ways for orders to take effect. They can be just direct orders about that one topic, or they can be mixed in with also their use of force directives, the what we commonly call rules of engagement, targeting directives, that sort of thing. They can all be impacted directly by the language that you find in the written arrangement. So from that military perspective, it's really, again, about, like everybody else, is seeking the clarity, because you just don't want 1,000 soldiers trying to figure out what the arrangement means individually.
Thank you, Blaise. Such an important point. Ben, please, the final minute to you.
Thank you. In 1 minute, we've all been shocked by the horrors that we've seen beginning on the 7th of October and since then. Secondly, it's important, I think, for us to look down the road, and if we look down the road, the current trajectory of the conflict is untenable. It really is untenable from a humanitarian point of view. We are in the midst of a catastrophe, and it will only get worse. It's untenable also from a legal point of view, in our view, and it's untenable politically because of the implications for the region. And lastly, I would say that a lot of people have discussed the sense of this being an existential conflict, a sense of it being existential for Israelis, and it is also existential for Palestinians. And it is that existentialness and those fears that are driving the conflict. We have to flip that round so that drives a positive solution. That is really the only way. We desperately hope that can be done, and we'll see a political solution. Thank you.
Blaise, Manu, Ben, amid these dark days, thank you so much for shining a little light on these issues. From a legal, military, operational, humanitarian perspective, your expertise today has been really greatly appreciated, and hopefully has given us all a little bit of a better common understanding of some really challenging issues. And I really wanted to thank the audience for joining us today, the great questions that have come in. As Manu said, I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of them, but there's certainly there was certainly many valid questions there. And yes, just everyone, please be tender to yourselves, be kind to yourselves, one another, look after each other, and take good care. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.